a little bit past time to get started. We are continuing our study. Today's only our second class. We're using as the basis of our study Nathan Ward's book, Our Eyes Are On You, a study of biblical prayer. Some of you already have copies of the book, some of you do not. We will try to get a few more copies. I had made some basic outlines for this morning's lesson. I've scattered some of those around. I underestimated how many people we would have out here in the auditorium class. I only got 3 outlines left. Does anybody want? I mean, I'm happy to give those out. There's no reason for me to keep them. Anybody else want a copy of the outline? A couple down this row. Got one left. Anybody else need one? You want one? There you go. And if you don't have one, I apologize. I'll make more of those going forward. We'll try to get a few more class books. How many of you would be interested in having a copy of the class book and don't currently have one? One? 2? Okay. We'll try to pick up a few more of those and make sure we get those to you. Again, we had said with the class book we were trying to share those a little bit. They're not your typical $5 or $6 book. They're a bit more expensive than that, but we want you to have a copy of it if it's something that you will use, that you will study and you will read. Well, basically, these outlines that some of you have, I said I'd go through each one of these lessons, and I'm going to try to make a basic outline that just kind of helps you follow that discussion. I said this is a little bit of a learning curve for me. I've taught many classes. I've used other material many times. It's not very often that I have used material that's written out in a full kind of dialogue form and tried to turn that into a class where we have the discussion and we go through our study. So I've got a little bit of a learning curve on that. That's why I'm kind of creating these basic outlines that we'll use for our discussion as we kind of go through those points. It's not going to cover everything that's in the book, all the points that Nathan Ward made and some of the observations. Sometimes I will read directly from the book and kind of pull that out, some of his quotes and some of those things that he said. But hopefully it will still be useful material for us, and we'll get a lot out of it as we study this topic of prayer. We mentioned last class, I spent too much time introducing the subject of prayer, talking about prayer in general. But the difference in this study compared to what maybe you've had in other studies on prayer, at least other studies I've had on prayer as well, and Nathan mentioned this in his preface and his introduction to the book, most of the time we study prayer from the standpoint of different subjects related to prayer, principles of prayer, the philosophy of prayer, for lack of a better term. You know, here's who we pray to, here's what we pray about, here's how we, but it's all been dissected and we kind of talk about those basics without actually looking at that many prayers. The intention of this study is the opposite. It is using the prayers that we find in the Bible. And then, yes, of course, trying to understand the context, the content, the connections, the applications that we would make from that, but from looking at different prayers, each lesson, just a different prayer in the Bible. The first one that we used wasn't typically viewed as a prayer. It was the discussion between Abraham and God relating to Sodom and what God was going to do when he goes down there to Sodom, is destroying the city. But it could be classified as a prayer insofar as somebody's talking to God. Abraham was communicating with God, and well, what if there's 50 righteous? What if there's only 45, 40? And we made some applications and some discussions from that. The prayer that we're going to study this morning in Genesis chapter 24 is more of what you might consider a traditional prayer. It's actually a prayer that somebody prays to God. They're not seeing God. They're not involved in a discussion with God. God hasn't manifested himself in some other way in a physical form or anything like that, like we might have had in the previous occasion dealing with Abraham. But instead, it's this prayer of Abraham's servant for success in his journey when he goes to get a wife for Isaac, when he's sent by Abraham to get that wife. And so we're going to use Genesis 24. The prayer itself is found in just verses 12 through 14, but we need to talk about that context and kind of get into some of the other applications of those things so we understand what's going on. So before we get started this morning, let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer, and then we'll get into our study. If you would, please bow with me. Our Heavenly Father, we come before you this morning. We thank you for all the blessings you give to us. We are so grateful for this day of life. We're thankful for our health and our strength. We're thankful for this opportunity that we have, that we can come together with others who share our faith, that we have the opportunity to worship you this morning, and that we have the opportunity to spend time studying from your word. We thank you so much for the revelation that you have given to us, that we can know your mind and your will, that we can learn from these things. And Father, as we study the subject of prayer, we thank you for the blessing of prayer, the privilege that we have to come before you and to express ourselves to you. Help us to learn how to do that better and how to have a relationship with you, and that we would take advantage of these blessings, these opportunities that you've given to us, that we could grow in our faith and that we could grow in our relationship with you. Bless us in this effort. Please forgive us of our sins. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, I want to go ahead and pick up, and let's just read through the first 11 verses. On the basic outline that I have, we've got the context, Genesis 24, 1 through 11, and we'll talk about this a little bit. Yeah, David?
I don't mean to be on tax, but I was thinking...
But you're going to anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
When I was thinking last week, we were talking about the boldness of Abraham, we were talking about...
Yes, his boldness.
But one thing that I thought we never mentioned was, it's kind of hard to know, because without being there to see his body language, the expressions on his face when he was asking these questions. And that's something we didn't bring up. I wish I would have brought that up then, because to me, that would be very important.
Yeah. And that's a challenge. I mean, we'll mention that. We did talk a little bit about not understanding even what was taking place culturally, how language is used differently. One of the things we have to keep in mind in these written records that we have, all we have is a written record, and oftentimes the written record does not record, tone, intent, how things are said, and we have to be careful that we don't overstep our bounds in either direction in that. I think you're right when we talk about the boldness of Abraham, to be willing to go to God and kind of, well, God, far be it from you that you would destroy a city like this. Certainly you would not let the wicked perish with the righteous. How you say that makes a huge difference in whether it seems to be accusatory, to what level of boldness. It's still bold to bring it up, but you make a very good point. We don't know entirely how he said that. I know with expressions and different things, I can think of a very common other example that you sometimes have to tell people, well, it probably didn't sound the way it sounds to us. When Jesus' mother comes to Jesus and is upset because they're at the wedding feast in Cana, they've run out of wine, and of course Jesus has that famous statement, "Woman, what does that have to do with me?" In our day and age, if I had ever said that to my mother, I would still be asleep right now. She would have knocked me out. You don't call me woman, and it sounds very disrespectful. Well, that's a cultural thing. He was not being disrespectful. We have to understand it different. That'd almost be like, ma'am, this is not really my concern. Now, you still might say, what does that have to do with me? That still might sound disrespectful, but we have to be careful with that. And you make a good point. We did also point out with that, for those who were part of that discussion on Wednesday night, while Abraham showed some level of boldness in bringing this up to God, he still showed tremendous humility. He kept saying, it's not really my place, and please don't be angry with me, and I'll just speak once more. So he was bold insofar as he felt he could come to God and talk about whatever he wanted to talk to God about, but there was a humility that showed that this is God's area of concern. I am just a human being. I'm not telling God how to do his job. And you make a great point there. Any other comments? Since David thrown us back to Wednesday night, any other comments from Wednesday night? No, that's a really good point. I appreciate you bringing that up. Anything else that somebody wants to bring up from that prayer? Again, we got kind of a little bit short on that prayer, and I apologize for that. But some of these same themes that were in that first prayer will pop up again, over and over and over again in some of these other prayers. So we'll get a chance to talk about that, including boldness in prayer and humility in prayer. Okay. If not, then let's go ahead and start reading Genesis 24, 1 through 11 to get the context of this particular prayer. It says, "Now Abraham was old, advanced in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in every way. Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who was in charge of all that he owned, 'Please place your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live. But you will go to my country and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Isaac.' The servant said to him, 'Suppose the woman is not willing to follow me to this land. Should I take your son back to the land from where you came?' Then Abraham said to him, 'Beware that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me, and who swore to me, saying, to your descendants I will give this land, he will send his angel ahead of you, and you will take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free of this oath of mine, only do not take my son back there.' So the servant placed his hand under the thigh of his master Abraham and swore to him concerning this matter. Then the servant took 10 camels from the camels of his master and went out with a variety of good things of his master's in his hand. So that he set out and went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. He made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water when it was evening, the time when women go out to draw water. And so that kind of gives us, again, with all of these prayers, Nathan says he kind of follows this same pattern. He wants to talk about the context, then he'll talk about the content of the prayers, and then you start to make those applications. So in this context, I had a couple of bullet points in here. It's the servant of Abraham who is sent to get a wife for Isaac. One of the things we might talk about here in just a second, Abraham didn't want Isaac to go back to his homeland. Abraham did not want Isaac to marry a local. Those are things that brought out. We might have a little bit of discussion as to why you think that's the case. Once again, we got to be careful here because we're not specifically told. The text doesn't say, Abraham doesn't give the exact reasoning why he feels this way. I think it's pretty easy to come up with some reasonable explanations for why Abraham does feel this way. And of course the servant saying, what if she doesn't come back? Or what if she doesn't want to come with me? Even more emphatically, I think the point that's made there is Abraham says, well, God's going to bless you. God's going to provide for you. Don't worry about that. But if she doesn't, you'll be released from your obligation. Just do not take my son back there. I do not want my son going back there. That seems to be pretty important to Abraham. Now, when we put that into the broader context, that's not specifically mentioned, and not specifically mentioned in the book necessarily, in Nathan's comments about this, and not certainly in this text, is, of course, Abraham has been called out of this land, of his homeland. God has directed him to leave that place to go to where he is now. God wanted him to come here. God has promised this land to his descendants, that they are going to get to live in this land. There's a lot of things that are going to happen first. They're going to be aliens and slaves in a foreign land for 400 years. In the fourth generation, they'll come out of there. They'll come back and settle in this land. But this is the land of promise. This is the son of promise. Abraham's son Isaac, the one that's finally the fulfillment of what God said was going to happen. But as Abraham's getting older, Abraham wants to make sure that Isaac has a wife. Isaac has to be able to reproduce. He needs to have children to continue this lineage and to continue this promise. But it becomes very much of a concern to him as to who he marries. Now, one of the things that's brought out in the book, in some of Nathan's comments, and if you don't have the book, you may not think of that right away, and that's okay. Our first thought when we would think, why doesn't Abraham want Isaac to marry a person of the land? What's probably the first thing that we would think of? Why doesn't he want his son marrying one of these women? Why does he want the servant to go back to his homeland and go back to his relatives and pick a woman from there? What's probably the most natural reason that you would give why you think that would be the case? Don't worry about being wrong. You might be wrong. We'll do a big buzzer and an X. And David's not worried if he's wrong. Go ahead. Preserve the what? The lineage. Okay. That kind of family lineage. That could be part of it, and actually part of what Nathan will come back and say, he wants them to be from this Semite line, the same line that's blessed by God, the line of Shem. The Canaanites who live there in the land are not from the lineage of Shem. The Canaanites are descendants of Ham. The Canaanites were actually cursed because of the sin of Ham. Canaan is mentioned by name earlier in Genesis because of that. Now, to what degree does Abraham know that? I don't know. Abraham's not reading Genesis. Remember that. Abraham doesn't have a copy of Genesis with him. Genesis is not written until the time of Moses and goes back and tells us, but he still could know things that were handed down through the fathers. He could know the story of Noah. He could know what happened with Noah's sons. It's possible that he has knowledge of some of that, but that could be playing a part in it. Josiah?
The traditions are different than what Abraham wants his son to follow.
Okay, a lot of times, I think what we would first go to is, he really wants his family to be a godly family. He wants his family to be the right kind of family. Josiah only mentioned traditions there. Sometimes people have keyed in on religion, that he wants his wife to be a believer, like Abraham is a believer. The biggest problem with that that's brought out in our book is Abraham's family are not believers back home. They are idolaters. They were practicing all of those things. When we read in the text, those other people from his family back home seem to be practicing the same kinds of things that the Canaanites practice. I mean, we have trouble with idolatry. We have trouble with false gods. We have trouble with false worship. There's some reason that God told Abraham, leave your homeland and leave your family and go where I told him to. So I still think there could be a little bit of that. At least they're going to be closer. You know, maybe they'll understand each other a little bit better if it's my family, if it's my background, maybe even some of those things that, you know, aren't exactly right, but Abraham would understand where they're coming from, maybe would understand how to deal with that, how to correct that. Certainly people who come from my family, I would know something I wouldn't necessarily want people to marry into my biological family that I came from, or even the geographical region from which I originated. But there are some things that I would understand about that. You know, if you married somebody who was related to me or grew up in Iowa, in the part of Iowa I'm from, I understand some of those things. There's a reason I left 30-some years ago and I haven't gone back. But, you know, I would understand some of those things for where they're coming from. Any other thoughts on that? You know, he kind of suggests in the book that it didn't want him to be a Canaanite, wants to be from the descendants of Shem. Doesn't want him to be from, I think there's still also a sense that Abraham's family is supposed to be outsiders. They are not the people of this land. They are strangers. They are pilgrims. They are aliens in this land. This is not, and one thing that Abraham does know for sure, because God told him, is when his descendants come back later, they're going to destroy the people in this land because these are sinful people. Now, their sins are not yet complete. Their sins are not yet full. But could that complicate things a little bit more? If you knew that, you know, your family, your descendants, when they come back, they're going to wipe out the people of this area, and your son takes a bride from the people of this area, you know, they have other children with the people of this area. I mean, there may be some of just kind of maintaining this separation, this holiness that's there. And I might even say there could be, I know it's not time to make the connections and jump to the applications. I know there was a time when Christians seemed to be more content with being outcasts in their community. They seemed to be more content with not being, you know, the wise and the rich and the noble and the powerful. And it appears to me in recent years that more and more Christians want to be part of the higher ups in our communities. I'm not sure that that's a good thing. I'm not sure to whatever extent we start hobnobbing and rubbing elbows and you know, with the powers that be, that could mess us up a little bit because we become more concerned about what's going on here instead of our ultimate goal. You know, that's keeping our eyes set on our promised land, which is not here. But at least that's part of what is taking place here. You know, so he tells the servant, I don't want my son to marry somebody from here. I want somebody from back home. I want them from, you know, my relatives, my background, my lineage, maybe traditions, maybe some religious beliefs in there to whatever extent that they have some knowledge of the true God, Yahweh. Why doesn't he want his son to go back there? Maybe. Again, we're not told. That would make sense. They're supposed to, this is our home, or is going to be our home. This land where we're traveling, this is where we belong right now. Even though we are aliens and strangers, our descendants will possess this land. We don't yet possess it, but this is our home. And so he doesn't want him to go back to such an extent that if the servant says, what if she won't come with me? You know, well, on the one hand, God will provide, which there's a big lesson there that Abraham believes that. But on the other hand, if he doesn't, then fine. You know, if this is a failure, it's a failure, but we're not going this other route. Josiah?
If the family is still viewed as outcasts and someone remembers who Isaac is or who Abraham's family is, that could be just a bad situation overall. So just avoiding that altogether, not putting that as a possibility to endure.
Good point. All right, any other comments from that part, the first 11 verses? You know, there's one other thing that takes place there, the oath and the swearing, and there's awkwardness there in the text. I don't know if we've talked about this before. I actually had this type of thing come up in my freshman Bible class just this last week. He places his hand under his thigh and makes him swear. What's he swearing on there? He's actually putting his hand near his reproductive organs and making him swear on that. And that was an ancient Near Eastern tradition, an ancient Near Eastern culture. But this is where children come from. This is where descendants come from. This is where your future comes from. There was an understanding of how it's almost like, swearing on your descendants or swearing on, that kind of thing. We are more likely, over my heart, cross my heart. That's where we're thinking, because the center of our emotions, the center of our devotion. It brings a little weird to us to have them, place their hand there, down under their thigh. But it's because they understood the importance of this is where my lineage comes from. This is my future. This is my family. These are my descendants. And so that's where that comes from. It is also an interesting note that in English we have certain words that have come over to English from that. Of course, down in that area, we have the testes, the testicles. That's where testify, testimony, testament come from. They're all coming from that same idea. This is something that's important. This is the future. So it wasn't something sexual, but it's more about this is where our future family is coming from. These are where my descendants come from. And so that was the importance of that oath. I think that oftentimes gets overlooked because it's just an awkward thing to try to discuss in our culture. But that's what's taking place there. Yeah, David.
I never really find that came up because I was even.
What a weird thing. Put your hand under your thigh.
I know. I was thinking about it earlier. I thought, why not just hold someone's hand in your hand? But I'm glad that came up because that's what I love. I love these studies. That things come up all the time that even though we've studied for years and years and years, there's so many things that come up that even my friends do that once or twice, and study, and I just miss so much of it. It's just.
Well, I do think it's important. By the way, that's the same thing. The other discussion that we were having in my freshman Bible class is why circumcision was used as a sign. It is a lousy sign for outsiders. Nobody knows if you're circumcised or not. You're not going around and, well, are you really? Oh, yeah, okay. They drop their pants and check. Yep, you're a Jew. You're a member of the covenant because you've been circumcised. It's the same idea, though. This is where your descendants come from. It's dealing with that part of us that so your children are children of the covenant. And this is going on in your lineage. And so they're related to each other. And again, that's not about sexuality. That's about how God gives us children. This is the next generation. This continuing on in this family line. So it certainly makes sense here, especially with an oath like this, because it's about getting him a wife and where the children are coming from, that this oath is taken in that way. And I appreciate your comment. Let's go ahead and get into any other comments from the first 11 verses or questions about those first 11. Let's get into the prayer itself. That it's a very short prayer. He took the camels, he took all the goods, he goes to the well. I guess we could say something about that. Why do you go to wells? Well, eventually people have to come to the well. The women will come out, they're going to get water at the well, and it's done pretty much every day, sometimes multiple times a day. So if you're going somewhere and you want to meet people, you want to find out who's there, there could be more going on, but at the very least, that's where you go and you meet people. That's where you find out who lives in the area. They don't all go to the city center, they all go to the well. That's where they're going to go. And then we're told in verse 12, and he said, Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show kindness to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Now may it be that the young woman to whom I say, please let down your jar so that I may drink, and who answers, drink, and I will water your camels also, may she be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac, and by this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. Again, that's the prayer that we're studying this time. It's a short prayer. It doesn't have a lot going on. It has a few interesting things going on in there. Probably one of the more interesting things is how specifically he asked for that sign, which we'll talk about a little bit. Here's what I want you to do, God. I'm going to say this, they're going to do this, and that's how I'm going to know that this is your will. It's very formulated. He kind of lays it out for God. But when you're talking about this idea, there's 5 points that were made in the book, which I think were the selfless prayer, the knowledge of God, the knowledge of the covenant, finding the right girl. I mean, that's what we're trying to find here. And then, of course, God answers this prayer. And we'll read a little bit further in the text how that prayer is answered and what God does. But certainly elements of this prayer, it is a prayer for success, but this servant is really interested in success for his master. This is about God doing for Abraham what Abraham wants done or needs done. Providing a wife for Isaac. This servant really doesn't have anything in this except for the fact that he's a servant. I mean, he's been sent on a mission, so you could say there's a little bit of selfishness in there where he wants success. Please help me be successful. I don't want to be a failure as an employee. I don't want to be a failure as a servant of my master's household. But he really focuses the entire thing on the success of others. I mean, he's going to be successful so that Abraham's plan is carried out. Isaac gets the wife that he wants. And once again, we have this selflessness in some of these prayers. That was one of the elements in the first prayer, which really wasn't a prayer. But you know what? Why was Abraham talking with God and asking for Sodom to be spared? Well, it's for other people. It's no skin off Abraham's nose if Sodom gets destroyed. But he's thinking, what about the righteous people who live there? I want to pray for them. He might have been thinking about his nephew Lot and other people. I want to pray for them, for their good. Here we have this kind of a prayer that's made. This knowledge about God. He trusts in God. It's the God of his master Abraham, but he knows something about him, and he comes to him and he prays to him in this way. The knowledge of the covenant, that's a point that's made in the book that's kind of easy to miss because of our translations. The loving kindness, the steadfast love that's mentioned in his prayer, and he mentions it a couple of times, that you've shown this loving kindness to Abraham, and that you show this loving kindness or steadfast love. I don't know if other translations have other words that are used there in Genesis chapter 24. Again, he says it near the end of verse 12, to show kindness to my master Abraham, and he says it again at the end of verse 14, that you have shown kindness to my master. The Hebrew word that's actually used there is this word hesed, which is this faithful love, this covenant love, this loving kindness, this steadfast love. The problem we run into is we don't really have a good English word to translate hesed. Hesed, when it's used in Hebrew, it's not just, I'm not sure I like kindness. Kindness seems way too weak. This is a really strong, connective, unfailing love and commitment toward somebody. That God's connection to Abraham is hesed. I mean, it is this loving kindness that lasts forever, this steadfastness. Again, in our Psalms, sometimes when that word is used, it will be translated, your loving kindness is everlasting. Your hesed, your faithful love doesn't ever fail. That he has some understanding of this, and that he is connecting that to what he's praying. And again, we could get into some of the specifics, trying to find this right person. Please let it be. All these women are coming out. I'm going to ask one of them, can I have a drink? And if one of them says, well, sure, yeah, here, I'm going to give you a drink, and I'm going to water your camels, then I know that's the one. Now, we'll talk a bit more here in a few minutes about whether you should put specific qualities like that in a prayer. Please God, I'm trying to make the right decision. Please make it be that when I go into the store and I ask what's on sale, and they say this, and that's what he's getting a lot of specifics in there. But certainly there's some qualities and characteristics of this person that he's identified, if nothing else. Stephanie?
Well, I think that's one area where you really would want to be specific in your prayers when you're praying for who you're going to meet and that spouse that you are looking for your whole life. I mean, if you've thought about it enough and prayed about it enough, you probably know some qualities at least. I would be specific
Sure.
about that.
Okay. And the qualities that he identifies here, if you're saying that, what is it about this woman? If he says this to them and they're willing to give him water, and they don't even know who he is, and they're willing to water his camels, And, you know, again, they don't know who he is. And I put it in the outline because it was mentioned in the book as well. You know, he had brought 10 camels with him. Camels are known to drink up to 25 gallons each when they stop to get water. If she's pulling a jar out of the well, she's going down and drawing water, and she's going to water these 10 camels until they're done drinking, which is really what the text says. That's a servant's heart. That's somebody, it's not just a matter of, well, I'll give you a sip of what I have, and I'll sprinkle a little bit over there for your animals. I mean, she could be doing some significant work here for a person she doesn't even know. And this is a stranger. Well, this is that hospitality that is talked about in the New Testament and in the Old Testament.
And I think with that, you also need to talk about time.
Yeah.
It's going to take that would delay their routines that they would have to do, because there's a lot of chores in that culture that you're supposed to do in a certain time frame, so that everything else sort of fell in line for your family. So that takes a lot of time to do that many jars, and for someone you don't know, for someone who's different from you, for lack of better words.
Yeah. And these women that are coming to the well, again, they're not just doing the well for themselves. You said these routines, this water's going back home. There's other things that you know, might be waiting on dinner. You know, I gotta get the water back, we're gonna do these other things. So you're delaying everything else, and I'm spending my time and my energy and my effort on this. I put everything else on hold. You've become most important to me. You know, it's reminiscent of Abraham with the angels show up and, hey, stop what you're doing, sit down. Hey, Sarah, go make a meal. We're going to bring them a meal. You know, we want them to rest. We don't even know who these people are, but we're going to take care of them like that. Jan?
It's not a culture that the servants draw water.
Yeah.
All the young ladies are coming to draw water.
Yeah.
Not the servants.
Right. Well, that's women's work, Jan. You know, it is pretty typical for the women to always be there at the well. You know, I don't know what else to say about that in a deeper cultural study. You know, there's even been lessons done on, you know, you go to the well, meet a woman. That's where we always find women at wells, even when Jesus is resting and he stops and rests by the well. The Samaritan woman comes out there. So they are the ones that are doing that. You might wonder, why isn't it, you know, the servants? I don't know, maybe you have the servants doing some harder things somewhere else. Maybe they're out in the field, you know, doing something else. But you said the daughters and the wives and the women could go do that. Yeah.
When you ask about specifics, when I was listening to you read about it, I would think that there would be multiple women that might offer to give him water.
To drink.
Because it's an easy thing.
Right.
But the person to take it the next step and offer to do really hard work would be the one that would benefit.
And some of this in the specifics, again, it's probably embedded. He would expect most of these women will probably say, if I can have a drink, can I please have a drink? They're probably going to say yes. They're probably going to say yes. They've been trained up. But the one that goes this extra mile and says, not only that, you know, you just rest here for a little bit. Let me water your camels for you. That's above and beyond. That's going that extra mile. Somebody who, you know, it does have the type of characteristics and qualities you can be looking for. It's not just a random test. You know, it's not, let it be that when I go to the well and a woman comes up and I say, what's your favorite color? And she says green, that that's the one that you've chosen. No, this is a little bit more embedded in service, and there's a purpose behind this test. And it's showing that kind of hospitality and service. Who else had their hand up? Yeah, David.
Also say, you said 10 camels? So
Yeah, that's what the text
So
says.
that's 250 gallons.
250 gallons of water.
So, but also, I think the reason why they chose 12 is because you can go a lot longer without food if you can water.
Sure.
Which to my,
Sure.
I think that would be a lot of the more specific thing why
Oh, yeah.
go to the well.
Well, they do, and people will go visit the well multiple times a day for that reason. I mean, if you're going to meet somebody, everybody living in the area is going to come to that well.
Okay, show up there.
They're going to somebody representing them, or somebody taking something back to them. I mean, unless you're living right by a river, you know, at another source. I mean, that whole community within walking distance is coming to that well. So that's where you get to meet everybody in the area. Stephanie?
I was just thinking, this is more about that practicality, and like Jen was saying, I wonder if it's, I mean, there's so many things you need water for. You need it for the cooking, the cleaning, so many things. I wonder if it wasn't every woman's responsibility to, like, hey,
Sure.
it's not just a servant girl, but we need so much
Sure,
water.
they need a lot of water.
All of the women are gonna go get the water,
Right.
you know.
their share of it. Any other comments or questions? That's the prayer that he prays. And again, it's this selflessness, but what he specifically asked for. Yeah, Kyle.
Not a water question. But,
Yeah.
So it starts off the prayer like, "Oh Lord God." Does that translate into Yahweh or anything?
Lord is Yahweh. Yahweh, God of my master Abraham. Yeah. He uses the name of God there. And so, I don't know what most of your translations do with that. The one that I'm looking at, again, Lord is in all capital letters. And that's usually the indication of the Old Testament that we have the name of God used there. So, what point would you make from that? You're just asking?
Yeah, it's interesting how you see different prayers start and how people start prayers, and you think your own prayer, how you start off. And I don't know if there's a right or a wrong, so see so many different examples of it.
Yeah.
But it is interesting.
Yeah.
Just find out how they would address it.
Yeah. Nathan has an interesting comment about that in his preface to his book, because on a book on prayer, he says sometimes this question has come up, should we be calling God by his name? You know, God identifies himself by name to some of these people, and that's what distinguishes him. And one of the things I would say about that in this prayer, this servant knows the name of God. He knows him as Yahweh. He doesn't just know him as God. He knows him as Yahweh, the God of his master Abraham. You know, Nathan said, I didn't do that in my book. I followed. Of course, we all know the Jews had the habit of not pronouncing the name of God. They did not want to mispronounce the name of God, so they had the tendency to replace it with Lord or with God when they did it. And one of the points that he makes, I think, was a good point. In the New Testament, when Jesus references the Old Testament, he'll go ahead and say Lord or God. He won't say the name of God. Paul never felt the need to change it back to the name of God. So I don't think there's anything wrong with us identifying God by his covenant name, except for maybe, he also makes a point, we're not entirely sure that it was pronounced Yahweh, because they just fell out of the habit of pronouncing it. They have the 4 consonants that are there. They didn't have vowels in the Hebrew. But certainly it is significant when we see it that somebody knows his covenant name. Somebody knows the actual name of God. He's not just God. He's not just Lord. He's Yahweh, Jehovah, different translations of that identifying name of God. I think that really is significant here, that the servant would pray to him by name, and cry out to him that way. Yeah.
I think it speaks further to the faithfulness of Abraham. We talk about that a lot in certain lessons about when he took his son to sacrifice him, that was credited him righteousness. But it's easy when you read the Bible to read these stories about these characters that God has presented to us to learn from, that it's easy to view these people like this servant as a small side character and fail to realize that this was a person like us that had a life and lived, they had their own responsibilities, and that speaks to credit of Abraham, that his servants were, at least this servant in general, he taught him, like Abraham.
Yeah.
He spoke to God, and then he turned around and told not just his family, but he told the people that were his servants and everything else that he brought them up, right? So
Yeah.
it speaks to his
It does. Great point. And by the way, to put that into the context too, because you mentioned another very significant event in the life of Abraham. We're here in Genesis 24. Where does Abraham offer up Isaac? 22. It just happened. It's not that far back in the record, showing his faith. God will provide. The Lord will provide. Well, look, if the Lord provides there, the Lord's going to provide a wife for my son. I believe that. I believe that with all of my heart. And he's conveyed that to his servants. He's taught that in his household. He's taught this kind of trust in God. Now, as the story unfolds, we're not going to have the time to read through all of that. You guys know how that happens. It came about before he finished speaking. Rebecca comes, and she does exactly what he said, and there's that exchange. In some of these connections, there is the other prayer. Let me mention the other prayer, which I had a typo in there that he prays again, Genesis 24, 26 through 28. It's just 26 and 27. The man bowed low and worshiped the Lord. Verse 27 is the prayer. And he said, "Blessed be the Lord, Yahweh, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness, his hesed, his loving kindness, and his trustworthiness towards my master. As for me, Yahweh has guided me in the way to the house of my master's brothers. He praises God. He uses his name again. His faithfulness, his trustworthiness. It's not just his love, his loving kindness. He's trustworthy. You can trust him. He said he's going to do it. He's going to do it. And I think there's some obvious connections there with this covenant focus, this faith that God acts, doing those kinds of things as well. We've got just a minute or two. What time are we supposed to hit? Probably like 2 minutes? Yeah. Comment, George.
And I think one thing that stands out to me in this particular exchange, outside of the prayer, is just the way that this servant is handling this entire process. It shows a much better servant-master relationship, or how great that relationship must have been between Abraham and his servant. The fact that he shows the same love for God that Abraham does, the way that he prays to him, but then the fact that he's that concerned about this happening the way that it should.
Yeah. What a great example of a servant. Aren't you glad we have his name? We don't. Don't need it. He's just a servant. But that relationship that's there, yeah, that's a great point. All right. Any final, if somebody got something that just they want to say, I know we've already rung the bell, but Jan?
How about the fact he pulls out the gold before he knows that what it
Yeah. He pulls that out and says, okay, who are you?
Yeah.
He's getting it ready. I don't know what he had given it to. I mean, it doesn't say the transition.
It doesn't say he actually uses it.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of confirmation there, and I don't know what to do with it. It's supposed to be from back home, and that's who they are, and it's supposed to be part of his relatives. She does what he asked, and he's kind of like, this has got to be her, and he's getting everything ready, and then asks, and then finds out, yep, she's from that family, that's where she comes from. God has blessed me in that. There's certainly some other application we can make. There's some things you'll carry over. As I said before, these prayers, there's going to be a repetitive nature of it. So some of these connections that we would have made that we didn't have time to talk about today, they'll pop up again in other prayers, and we'll get some chances to do that. Maybe even including this idea, should we ask for these specific signs? Now, there's a big discussion of that in the book. If you've got the book, I would encourage you to read that. This servant didn't have anything else to go off of. We have God's word. We have his guidance. We have other things. I don't know that we should pray, I'm going to be sitting in the coffee house and I'm going to go up to a boy, and if I ask, can I have a piece of your cookie? Not only does he say, you can have a piece of the cookie, I'll give you my coffee too. That's how I know who I should marry. Should we be doing those kinds of things? I think that can become a little trivial. There's more going on here than just saying, I'm going to ask somebody, what's your favorite color? And if they say it's turquoise, I'll know they're the one that I'm supposed to marry. But there is this idea of trusting in God and looking for his guidance in these things. And we need to have that aspect of trusting in God and looking for his guidance in these things. All right. Appreciate your comments. We will leave off there, and we will pick up on Wednesday night with the next prayer. So I'll try to get a few more copies of the book, and we'll try to get ahead on these outlines that I'll give to you too, so you can have them ahead.
Yeah, I got a little chilly.